it's, Armenians have always been integrated into these countries. I mean, Armenians are part of Lebanese society, for
Yeah.
example, and they're part of Palestinian society. And I mean, the the tiles on the Dome of the Rock, the mosque, are Armenian. The Belian, you know, those beautiful tiles are made by Armenian artisans. Right. So it's not even like a Christian thing. Like, of course, Armenians going to hang out with like Arab Christians. No, it's like these Armenian, like when you look at what is now Palestinian tiles, those tiles, the typical Palestinian tiles, are basically Syrian, from Syrian and Armenian. And that's because of Syrian and Armenian, because they're from largely the same place, and they were kicked. They both genocided, right? Ashuriyin and Syrian, and all the immigrants into historic Palestine.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Other Armenias podcast. I am your co-host, Tamar Shirinyan.
And I'm Milena Abrahamian, your other co-host.
So just as a reminder, if you are listening to this on YouTube, please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And as a reminder, also, we are on Spotify. So if you haven't found us on Spotify yet, you can find us by looking up Other Armenia's podcast, and make sure to also follow us on there and to rate and comment. Today, we are having a very exciting conversation, an interview with two really awesome people who Milena will introduce.
Yes. So today we have on Lara Sheehi and Stephen Sheehi, and I'm going to just introduce them very briefly. I'm also going to turn off the sound on my phone so you don't hear that. So, Lara Sheehi is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, Qatar, and a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. She is the founding faculty director of the Psychoanalysis in the Arab World Lab. Lara's work is committed to decolonial and feminist methodologies and especially interested in psychoanalysis, the psychic refusals central to liberation struggles and life-making in the global South, the psychic dimensions of resistance and revolution, and critical Zionist studies. She is co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which won the Middle East Monitor's 2022 Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book. Lara is the immediate past president of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology and co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality. She is also a member of the founding collective for the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. She is currently working on a new book, From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures. And we have Stephen Sheehi, who is the Sultan Qaboos Professor of Middle East Studies at William and Mary in Arabic Studies, Asian and Middle East Studies, and Asian and Pacific Islander American Studies. Among a number of books, articles, and book chapters around Arab photography and cultural history, race, anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia, and more recently, gender and sexuality, he is co-author with Lara Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which was awarded the 2022 Palestine Book Award. He is also the author of Camera Palestina with Salim Tamari and Issam Nassar. His current research project is entitled On Guerrilla Intimacies, Social Objects and the Palestinian Decolonial Now. Wow, what impressive bios you have. We're excited to have you on.
So, before we get into our discussion, I just want to kind of introduce this book, and I'll be very, very brief. So, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. So, we're going to be talking a little bit about this book today, as well as other things. So, just to give a little bit of framing, this book is the book on contemporary possibilities of psychoanalysis toward decolonization and liberation. I've read many of the books that purport to be about this, and none of them get close to offering what this book does. So Lara Sheehi and Steven Sheehi carefully and productively provide an analysis of the ways in which Israeli psychoanalysts, psychologists, and psychiatrists in occupied Palestine work, sometimes quite hard at ignoring the political and social determinants of Palestinian mental health, colonialism, apartheid, and military occupation, and instead build barricades to ensure that those realities stay outside of the clinic. This, of course, results in epistemic violence of various and often extreme sorts. Sheehi and Sheehi go beyond the foundational work of Frantz Fanon, who writes on the psychology of the colonized and the ways in which it is produced through racist encounters with the colonizer. Drawing on this foundational work, Sheehi and Sheehi allow us to go on a journey with them to study not only the psychology of the oppressed and not only how psychoanalysis oppresses, but also the profound resistance work that Palestinian clinicians offer their clients, even when it needs to reach beyond the barricades of colonial violence done to them as Palestinians as well. Sheehi and Sheehi argue that the political cannot remain outside of the clinic in a decolonization of psychoanalysis has great potentials toward a decolonized Palestine. The framework they offer, much like the now canonical theory of decolonization writers of the mid-20th century, such as Amy Césaire, Walter Rodney, Amilcar Cabral, and Fanon, amongst others, allow us to think about the frameworks of colonialism and imperialism and decolonization far beyond any one case study. Today, we hope to think with them about how some of the conceptual frameworks they offer in the book might be of use for our project of Other Armenias. Their deep solidarity with their case study with Palestinians, however, is the essence for this possibility of far-reaching insight. So with that, I thought I would ask you to kind of talk a little bit about something that you write about in the book, which is reality bending. And I've thought with this concept, as you have in the book, in some of the writing that I've done and the thinking that I've done, and this is something that Milan and I both find really compelling, to think about Armenia and to think about various kind of political contexts today. So let's start with reality bending.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us, first of all. I think it feels like a political intervention in and of itself, and a sort of a presencing to be with Armenian siblings as Lebanese Arabs. And that feels like a centerpiece to any conversation. And thank you so much for the really generous, both introductions and then the generous sort of opening up of the book and the space for the book. And I think it's so moving to both of us. I'll speak for both of us that you can engage with such depth and sort of cut right through and see exactly what we're trying to do and how this is a political project. And I think that any conversation about reality bending comes from that political project. And one of the ways that we talk about it in the book is sort of thinking about the logics of settler colonialism and imperialism and capitalism more broadly, but in the context of Palestine, really thinking about settler colonialism as a logic that insists on certain modes of being and subjectivity and social reproduction of the person, and that reality bending is a centerpiece of this. It's not like a sort of secondary symptomatic happenstance. It's central to the projects of settler colonialism to invite people, seduce them, conscript them into living a sort of everyday life, having to bend certain realities and certain knowledge that they know to be true,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that becomes a demand of being under the auspices of a settler colonial regime and the way that it functions. And so let me sort of be a little more concrete about that and sort of bring it back to the settler colony of the United States, where all of us are in right now, and think about the ways in which we're talking here about quotidian ways, like everyday things that you and I and all of us might not even realize that we are brought in to be engaged and sort of complicit with reality bending. So those of us who are in Turtle Island and might every day go about things and forget, and I'm putting it in quotes because that is a project. It's a settler colonial project for us to forget that this is stolen land, or to say that this is something of the past, and to forget all the ways in which the machinery of settler colonialism relies on a constant barrage, both psychically and judicially and relationally and politically, to have its machine run. And so I think if we can think about that very small example, right, and then transpose it to Palestine and say how the Zionist settler colonial regime relies on people also to forget. And by people, we mean certainly Palestinians. But I think one thing we can see about the genocidal campaign that's happening right now is what's the price that people pay for not forgetting, right? And for sort of staying true and saying, no, we understand this to be Palestine. This is a settler colonial imposition on a geographical location called Palestine, or in the stories in our book about the ways in which clinicians join with their patients to remain true and connected to the reality of Palestine, to the reality of the social fabric of Palestine, to the reality of psychic realities of what causes suffering and harm and psychic violence. And all of that is going back to the condition rather than sort of all these overlays over top of that, which is the cause of reality bending, right? So throughout the book, we have examples about how people, are invited to forget the condition of their suffering, or they're invited to forget that Zionism is what is the functional sort of fabric that's overlaid over Palestine and Palestinians. And that's what we mean by reality bending. Did you want to?
No, I mean, I mean, you lay it out. I think I would just add that, to think about, so what reality bending isn't, it's not necessarily sort of like, it's not the blue and the red pill, right? It's not the sort of glasses that say you see, without ideology and with ideology. It's actually sort of the psychological mechanism that power that structures to maintain ideological coherence. So, for example, as Lara's talking, she's reaching into the book, and thank you very much. But as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking about, for example, the arguments of the Armenian genocide, or against the Armenian genocide, right? Where, for example, the Turkish state won't necessarily deny that, you know, what I mean, they will deny 2 million Armenians were massacred or were genocide, but they won't deny that Armenians were killed, right? So they'll sort of have images and say, of course, these are refugees, and it happens, war happens, and or do really crazy things like actually get pictures of, you know, Armenian displaced peoples and then say these are Turkish displaced peoples and this happened on both sides, right? Like, so like really literally bending reality to sort of maintain an ideological coherence of the Turkish Republic, and the denial of the Armenian genocide. So the sort of the way in which ideological reality bending works then is to sort of, repurpose or recalibrate, as Lara said, the sort of material knowledge in which the oppressed already know to be true, but then sort of bend it back into ways to maintain the coherence of an ideological formation of the oppressor. I don't know if that's...
Yeah.
So yeah, one of the things that I'm thinking about here are the ways in which even things that we might take perhaps even more for granted than, even settler colonialism on Turtle Island, or the Armenian genocide, which is like the very political frameworks with which we think, like liberalism. And I'm reminded, today, the ways in which we are supposed to constantly believe, right, that anybody, and this is in the United States, right, that anybody who is protesting for Palestinian rights or against genocide is somehow anti-Semitic or is a terrorist. I mean, going that far, right, that anybody who is for the rights of Palestinians is actually not for the rights, and I mean the most liberal, right, of ideologies that we're supposed to, that the international order was founded on, right, human rights, the right to not be genocided, right, that comes out today as somehow being a terrorist, and we are actually supposed to believe that, and the more you don't believe that, the more you mark yourself as an enemy of all the states.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. And these are not innocent moves, right? They're not innocent. And I think this is what Stephen was saying about sort of an ideological coherence, maintaining an ideological coherence. And I would also say it's to stabilize a hegemonic narrative of history. It's to shore up and stabilize the machinery of settler colonialism to function as it's meant to function. It's not an aberration, right? For it to function the way it does, and for to reach into Patrick Wolf, is to make the settler native, and the native is the one who's somehow the stranger here. There's a multitude of psychic maneuvers that have to happen and everyday practices that have to happen to make that possible. Just like to make it possible that we can watch what's happening, and there are still, a host of people that might be like, to support Palestinian liberation means you are a terrorist. Right. We can look at that and be like, this is the most absurd thing, and sort of balk at it. But the infrastructure is such that it's such a daily repetition, the repetition of settler colonial reality bending, and the invitation to identify with that, right? These are the identifications that are asked of us. This doesn't happen seamlessly. And that's what I mean by it's not innocent. It's not an innocent, it is about a reproduction of a particular social order in Palestine, the heart of which is the supremacy of the settler over the lives and functioning and daily processes of indigenous people, Palestinians. What we map out in the book are all the ways in which Palestinians, and we can extend this beyond Palestinians to other indigenous peoples of the world, engage in psychic refusals and a reassertion and reaffirmation of their indigeneity in a particular way, and their knowledge, like Stephen was saying, of what they know to be true. And that is this is the psychic refusals against reality bending, how that becomes part of sustaining life and sustaining knowledge that seeks to be erased by settler colonial regime, right? That's again, the non-innocence. There's a pointed goal in genocide. There's a pointed goal in ethnic cleansing. There's a pointed goal in the projects of settler colonialism, and it is to vacate the land, primarily the land of those who know and remember and are lodged there. And we can think about that in very material ways, and then we can think about that psychically, and I think that's where the reality bending can come in. I think you wanted to say
No,
something.
I think you actually definitely made it into what I was going to say, which was to think that the reality bending you said about liberalism and the contradictions of liberalism and neoliberalism, which you're absolutely correct about. But it's not only about the ways in which we say, okay, people, this sort of absurdity, protesting a genocide are then somehow become the terrorists, which is a bizarre bending of reality in itself. But even the more sick and violent bending of reality is that the liberal values are actually used to justify the genocide of Palestinians, right? It's not just that you are an anti-Semite because somehow you are supporting these people who are anti-Semitic, who are now in a battle with, a state that it has legitimacy. It is you are defending, you are attacking the state that is doing the correct thing to annihilate subhuman actors who actually want to erase the existence of the aggressor, right? I mean, that is the
That's the
reality
psychic
bending, right?
inversion.
That's the psychic conversion. That's the reality bending, right? That the genocider is the one who lives in fear of being wiped out, as they literally wipe out a people, right? That is the reality bending. That's the absurdity of it, right? So yeah, I kind of, that is the pointed goal, as Lara said, and I think that is what the concept of reality bending sort of pushes further. It's not just a sort of a retooling of language, a discursive trick. It's the way in which people will actually justify Europe freaking does it, backs the right of Israel to defend itself, and that discursive claim, it doesn't seem absurd. It's even though it's a complete inversion of reality, right? They're defending themselves by wiping out children, and hospitals, etc. So.
And Stephen, I like the way that you put it. Like, this is not like the blue pill, red pill scenario, because I think that what's interesting about what you're doing in the book, and also what you're saying now, is that there's no like separation between the ideology of settler colonialism in a settler colonial state and the actual subjectivization of subjects of that state, whether that be the oppressors or the oppressed, the colonizers or the colonized, right? Like this is a context in which subjectivity is being produced, and this is something that we also learn from Fanon. But here it's that the reality bending. It's not so much that you can believe it or not, right? Like you can stay outside of it and not believe it and stay true to what because it is, as Lara, you point out, it's within the actual infrastructures. And so here, we're thinking about a lot of the licensing of psychology and psychoanalysis, of how things get funded, like where clinics exist and where care networks are provided, right? So it's not like you can choose to take the red pill or something. It's like those things are, subjectivity exists as part of systems of power and colonialism here.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also say that not only subjectification but the nullification, right? That is, subjects are produced, and when they can no longer will accommodate production, for example, in the interest of power and interest of the settler state, then they will be annihilated, right? I've always said, I mean, I think Israelis obviously want, I mean, and Zionism want the elimination of the Palestinians. What elimination looks like is another thing. Does that mean it's fundamentally that if all Palestinians just disappeared and they didn't have to murder them with their own hands, which is what they're doing in Gaza, would they prefer that? Yeah. But the problem is when they're trying to create a certain sort of subject, a docile subject, a sort of accommodating subject, an Arab Israeli rather than a Palestinian, right? That sort of production of when that sort of production of subjectivity runs its course and won't, and the colonized won't collaborate or be complicit any further, then subjugation runs its course, and then it's a nullification and elimination.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's why we also spend time, even as we sort of map out the infrastructure, the technologies of asphyxiation, like reality, that include reality bending. The book is also very much interested. I mean, we don't spend a lot of time on purpose analyzing the Zionist mind or thinking about it in that way. We very much spend far more time even in introducing reality bending, talking about the ways in which Palestinian clinicians, specifically in this book, but certainly their patients who are Palestinian, they are Palestinians themselves, right? About the active role, the willful role in being in an antagonistic relationship around this, and a refusal. The refusals are the place where this is really alive. Like, we are able to learn about reality bending through the refusals that people are engaged in, because the idea that we are engaging in refusals is part of what, I see this podcast as a part of that, is like a refusal to accept a one particular narrative around things. It's about contesting space and community and what that means, and categorization. And those are what we are thinking about as refusals to like everyday demands that can start to become, we can think about it as a disciplining process or a carceral process, that you just kind of go about taking in what is being told and what is the narrative that sort of saturates this subjectification. Or people can engage, and I'm not setting this up as a binary. To the contrary, it's a multitude of negotiations that end up being happening, but there is a conscious process. This is why we're using Martin Baró and Fanon's idea about disalienation, that there is a political education that works alongside the psychic awakening that says there's actually a refusal that is being embodied here. And that can look a lot of different ways. One of which is, I refuse to not be telling the truth about the condition that's happening here.
I'm just silent because I'm really overwhelmed by everything that has just like, we just dived so deep, like just head on into all of these things, and I'm just sort of relating to it, to my own life, to my family, to my community, my friends, and I'm also on my way back to Armenia tomorrow. So and just, it's always really interesting for me to leave Armenia and then be somewhere else, especially for an extended period of time, which to me is like anywhere more than 2 weeks, let's say, and then going back and sort of being exposed to other realities, let's say, and then going back. And how easy it is for me to get excited and inspired and motivated to think that, oh, I'm going to go and do this and that. And like, we're going to refuse, we're going to do these refusal action, like acts of refusal. We're going to do all these things. And, like, I know that it's usually not like that. Like, there's something that happens to me, like a kind of collapse when I'm there, and not only obviously a collapse, but I'm just saying these things, I guess, like out loud, like for the first time. So I'm maybe there will be more things I will understand as I'm traveling on this journey of better understanding how these things work. But one of the words that you're using, or one of the things that you're saying, is about the infrastructure of this sort of how reality bending works. And it's just, to me, and also like I wonder, like it's something that seems so abstract, but I know that like we're living in it, obviously. And to me it's always so like give hope giving or empowering, or I don't know what word to use, to sort of see like the bolts and the nuts and the things of how something works, so that I don't feel so helpless at the immensity of it. So I'm just thinking about this, and obviously like in the book we do see how these things work, better, but yeah, I'm just reflecting, and I don't, yeah, just these are my thoughts. It's just so that you don't think I'm quiet and nothing to say.
I mean, in the end, all these things that we speak about, whether it's in Palestine or elsewhere, is about, you don't, about power, right? It's not your reality bending. It's not like, it's not being gaslit, right? Or someone being like, nah, but I've experienced, nah, no, you didn't. It's your opinion over my opinion, and that people come and convince you you're wrong. No, I mean, it's power. It's the ways in which full state structures unfold infrastructure and structures to naturalize and justify their existence. And part of that project, and I think this is what we discuss in the book, it also means that project is also a psychological project. It's also to ping what is what gauges something reality or not reality. So you can see, for example, the transformations of psychologists who we really, take attention to in the book more than patients or the Zionist, regime. That is to say, even in their discussions, you can see their sort of transformations, because on one hand, they're being pulled by, they know what the material reality of occupation looks like on one hand. On the other hand, they're being put through this disciplinary practice of becoming licensed and educated. And on the other hand, but on the other hand, they're talking to Palestinian patients who they can connect with on a material level. They know that they're not lying, that there are things like checkpoints there, or that they actually live in a refugee camp that's not a resort, like the supervisor says, that these Palestinians live in such nice homes when she's looking over into a camp, right? And on the other hand, you have the supervisor who might say nice words of care. She's not saying, kill them. She's not Palpatine, right? But she's, saying words of care that might pull on the sort of values of the field, but in doing so, completely co-opting and bending the sort of ways in which that psychologists might start to identify with the power, with state structures. So what I hear from you is kind of that sort of unfolding of all that playing out in your own self, in your own mind, and in your own body, and in your own affect, right? I think that's kind of what we try to get at, I think.
Yeah. Tomat, I think you were going to say
Yeah, I
something.
mean, one of the things, when Milena was talking, Milena and I had a conversation. I won't bring all of the details to light because that might be a future episode. But the way in which, this part of the world, the Republic of Armenia, and of course there are many Armenias, and this is just one, but in the Republic of Armenia, liberalism has become so firmly, and I don't want to say rooted because it doesn't actually have deep roots. There's a very shallow rootedness. And it's very recent, and it is tied exactly to, the infrastructures that you're both naming, right? And I mean, very, very differently. We're not talking about, the kind of completely violent and militarily occupied settler colonial state that is Israel, but the way in which, because of international funding and mostly from the EU, governmental and non-governmental organizations, as well as USAID and the US State Department, and to firmly in place like a structure, an infrastructure of liberalism, it's become really difficult to imagine outside of those ways of thinking in Armenia. And I don't have the same experience there that Milena does, but I've noticed even in my kind of short history of, doing field work in Armenia, that you see this trajectory of like more fluidity with ways of thinking, where activists and even members, like staff members of NGOs, were more kind of open to other frameworks and other forms of thinking. Political change have become completely immersed with no windows in liberalism. And this is, one of the ways that we might think reality bending, as if this is and has been the only way of thinking the political in this part of the world. And Armenia is not alone in this. I mean, we see it probably even more horrifically, right, in Georgia today, Ukraine, in many
Oh,
in many parts of the world, but I think
Yeah.
especially in this really like
Yeah.
harsh way in the post-socialist, post-Soviet world.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's why, I mean, you're talking and I'm thinking about Lebanon, and I'm thinking about Lebanon as also deeply imbricated in the history of Armenia too, and the Armenian story. And I think this dislodging from historical, I think this movement towards liberalism in this way, where you describe it as like people then become almost in, conference rooms without windows, is like, and this was me having worked in state politics, for example, being a policy, and that is the way it's described, is like you make these policy decisions and you have no windows. I think it's a really good sort of visual for us. But again, if we're sort of going back to the condition that these things are not accidental, that the dislodging, and here's where I can speak to it from Lebanon, the dislodging from a historical precedent, including, by the way, political mobilization that refuses to be disconnected from these sorts of projects around, whether it's what we now know as NGOs or social projects, social welfare, empowerment of communities, then gets swallowed up by the sector, I think is one of many ways that you dislodge a people from a history that is revolutionary. And that has not just moments, but entire movements that we are meant to disconnect from, that we are meant to think about ourselves in isolation. And this goes back to, like, if we're thinking about disalienation or revolutionary project or any one of these things, if you think about yourself in isolation or as a moment in history alone, with no precedent, with no connections, with all of that, that is overwhelming. That is meant to create a particular type of inertia. That is meant to overwhelm our capacity to be able to not only imagine futures, but think about it as a constant, this is only happening in the far future, rather than kind of what Stephen's book project is about or anything. Is like there's things happening now constantly, both in terms of the way the infrastructure is meant to dislodge us from that, with a very particular aim. The aim of dislodging us and having to recreate history and moments all the time as individual moments is part of the larger project, where we forget our siblings and our revolutionaries, whether Armenian or Lebanese or Palestinian. That's like, this shit ain't new. Right? But the feeling of newness makes it feel so big and so untenable and so fixed. And I do think, and it misattunes us, I think, to all the ways in which refusals are actually happening, right? And especially, and this is what I'm thinking, Mileno, as you're speaking, right? Of like thinking about the purposeful misattunement away from all the ways that refusals are happening on a daily basis, and we don't register them, right? We're always looking for the big thing, but it's happening all the time.
And I think also that, I mean, I just can't help but to think about, for example, like, the Republic of Armenia, in many ways, thinking about like it as the prototype for potentially the Republic of Palestine, right? Which is, and to think about what Lara says about effectively sort of like having a forgetting of or disavowal of past revolutionary histories. I'm thinking about that more in terms of the ways in which these state formations capture history, right? Which is very much the case, I know, in the Armenian diaspora and in, to some degree, Armenia, where it's like I'm sure that they're very happy with the revolutionary history of the Armenians, but it's then sort of captured in a way that it will legitimate the state. And then that leads us into, and some of the things that you were talking about, both of you were talking about, is effectively what is also the logic of capital, right? The logic of capital, which then feeds into the ways in which you have a state, and they're saying, yeah, we had these great things and these great guys, and Asala was fantastic, and they did all their thing. However, right now we have to be pragmatic because we want development. Therefore, the logic of capitalism then comes to cut off any other possibilities because those possibilities are not realistic. And in fact, the state capture, the rewriting of history says, so it's like, okay, in fact, we failed at that. Where we had our revolutionary heroes, they did X, Y, and Z. However, they were also, they failed to do many things, and it wasn't a practical state building a project. And this is what a state looks like now. And therefore, we will neoliberalize our country because this is obviously going to be the only and best way to grow Armenia or whatever, or Palestine. And of course, I'm thinking about that with Palestine. Think about state capture in Palestine through NGOs, as Lara was saying, as about the ways in which they'll very happily elevate the revolutionary history, forgetting the fact that the revolutionary history was actually one of class warfare, against international capital and finance capital specifically, and just and kind of leaving that out because it really is not practical, and also not to mention the internal dynamics. Like, I don't know about Armenia, but I'm sure 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, that has a very robust ruling class that really has a lockdown on the vision of how you want to develop the society. And therefore cut off the possibilities that how can things be done otherwise, as Milena was saying, like getting excited and then kind of having to run up against the wall because no one's gonna let that happen, right?
Can I just say something? It's very interesting that you were making this comparison with there being this Republic of Armenia with something, what it could look like with the Republic of Palestine. It's very interesting to hear that. It's like the first time I'm hearing something so akin to that, because more likely, I guess, in more of the context that I'm in, within the, let's say, one of the worlds of Armenia that I occupy is more of this idea that the sort of the way that the existence of Armenia as a state is in many ways trying to imitate or has some kind of a way of trying to be a kind of Israel, actually.
Right.
Because maybe there's different links to why this is even thought in this way. Maybe it's connected to Armenians being a diasporic people, having also like the state building also having a lot to do with the narrations of the genocide in a particular way. And then I was thinking about, these, so many Armenias, like we have really like the name of this podcast, Other Armenias, where for me, like, I think even before there was a state, and obviously it's a global history, right, where it was not always nation states, it was, other ways of being, and for Armenians, I mean, for me, it makes sense that, we have been in these lands, basically, like where Armenia is now and surrounding. I mean, my own family is from those lands. And like currently, if I trace back, it's like cutting across borders of Armenia proper today into Georgia, into Turkey today, right? And there are many Armenians who would say cutting into Iran, and obviously like living under different sort of empires. But yeah, it's interesting. And then it's, to me, like thinking about how cool it is to be able to be so, like fluid and like moving and movement, and actually like being a Republic of Armenia. Like I'm just thinking, okay, I'm going back to this place with its borders, and I love that place. Obviously, I was born there, and I can't wait to go back. But I'm also like, I'm going back to a place that is, with borders and with two closed borders. I mean, that is not just a typical place. Obviously, I'm not going to Spain where I can just flow between, different borders within Spain. It's very, very particular. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, this is really all interesting. I mean, this is one of the big conundrums of Armenian nationalism and Armenian state building. I have probably like two separate projects and two perhaps even opposed projects, because we can think of Armenia as and that as having these histories with Palestine, as with the PLFP, PFLP, and Asala having close ties in the 1980s, and but now with a kind of militarized project and also claiming indigeneity. And this is the interesting part about, like, of course, Armenians are to a certain extent indigenous to various lands in Anatolia and the South Caucasus, and there's no denying of that. But it's also true, and I think this is, this might share some similarity also perhaps with Palestine, with Palestinians, that those indigeneities were always multicultural and multi-ethnic. And the way in which, Armenians claim, historic Armenia to be Western Armenia, or what is today Eastern Turkey, we might say Kurdistan. And it's true. Like, Armenians are from that land and have, like, for thousands of years, perhaps, right? Like, resided in those lands. But it is also true that there were always others, right? Non-Armenians also in those lands with whom Armenians built communities, and including religious communities, from the very ground up, from village life to larger regional life making and world making. Armenians were always caught up with others in these ways, and of course, the starkest example on everyone's mind thinking about Armenian indigeneity today is Nagorno-Karabakh. And Armenians continue to use the language of Artsakh, right, which of course, right, has an old formation on that land, but it also is a word that refers specifically to Armenian history on that land, rather than the various shared histories with other peoples on that land, including people from, the 19th and 20th century Azerbaijanis. And this is the reality bending that's happening within Armenian nationalism today, where we're supposed to believe as Armenians that that is our land. And they have evicted us from our land. And it is true that, Nagorno-Karabakh was ethnically cleansed of over 100,000 Armenians in 2023, just a month before the genocide in Palestine began. But it's also true that 20 years before that, Armenians did the same in that very land, right? And so it's these kind of it's like between occupier and occupied, and it's that kind of strange history of Armenia that I think we're trying to get at with other Armenias. And reality bending as a concept really aids us there.
Yeah. Did you want to say something? I was going to say just that, as I'm listening to this, there's a way in which, again, this is what helps me, is a return to the condition that creates the possibilities for those sorts of knowledges to be foreclosed upon, right? And I think that, when it's sort of like in the context of the United States, I often say this, where like white supremacy creates identities around racial formations. And then people are like, well, this is identity politics. So there's a reason why folks are invited into that space to have to lay claim to certain forms of identity formation as a response to a demand that comes from a system that has only one way to be legible. And I think I'm saying that because I think there are ways in which we can sort of get into this, okay, we need to hold on to all that. And I obviously I agree, we need to hold on to all these multiplicities and to remember that the world that functions within these enclosures is precisely why those become less and less able to be reached to. And that, I think, is the condition of oppression. If we go back to Palestine, is this idea of, nation building. Certainly we've heard about that. I think there's some formations, let's say, of anarchism that would be like, why are you even looking for a nation? I think we can all think it's silly that under settler colonial regimes that, of course, people are sort of reaching towards an understanding of what unifies this particular land, in the case of Palestine, from the river to the sea, being Palestinian. And also for us to be like, that enclosure system demands a certain type of position and a hard line to hold. And I think that that is for us to sort of be invited into that and be like, we understand the hard line that is being held here, because the force of the settler colonial regime and the everydayness of the things we were talking about locates people, sort of positions them in a particular way. And what we're trying to do in the book is say that there's a multitude of living, kind of like you were just saying, that happens within this space. And what happens when we actually wrench Palestinians out of this referential point that is always imposed on them, and say there's an entire thriving multicultural multiplicity of lives that are being lived every single day, and life is being forged every single day, that is, perhaps you can say, uniquely Palestinian. But the most important part of that is that it is not always in the shadow of this regime that insists on being known and making itself known in every single way. And that, to me, I think, is what feels really important about this. And I think what I feel an affinity to in this project that you all are doing is like, what does it mean when we try to forge life otherwise under something that feels like is already inscribed as a necessary end? Like, this is just the way that it is. So I found myself thinking through that actively as you were talking, but you wanted to say something.
I mean, it's hard to keep up with all the folks because there's a lot of things going on in my head, and I just don't, I don't want to get all nerdy and talk about nationalism and the history of nationalism and that sort of stuff. I try to think about like the way things are playing out now. But with that said, I think what you talk about, or you're talking about, Tamar, is to think about the ways in which identity is riveted to sovereignty, right? And sovereignty and national sovereignty and the nation state and the national sovereignty is always riveted, can only be enforced through violence. Right? It always can be enforced because you have a border, and there's no way to maintain a border without violence. And I'm just thinking about the ways in which sovereignty is not always connected to land itself, but even though that's the assumption, what nationalism does with sovereignty, it attaches sovereignty to the national subject, and where the national subject lives, therefore, it then becomes the condition, as Lara was saying, by which they can claim ownership of the land, which, of course, after that is the justification for violence and then ethnic cleansing, if that makes sense. So it's not like, oh, people live there in the land and this is Armenian land. It's Armenians are there and they are national subjects. Therefore, the land is. And I think this is what's nationalism differ. I think this is the way in which national identities might differ from indigeneity, if this makes sense. The way in which indigeneity works, I think the way we want to think about that is the way in which subjects emerge from the locality and the land. That's why we cannot critique, for example, even Armenian nationalism and Palestinian nationalism in the same way we should critique Zionism. Right? Zionism does not emerge. Zionism creates national sovereignty through the subject of the Jewish Zionist, and from that Jewish Zionist, that person then claims right over the land and in claiming right over the land, removes the trees, the grass, the swamp, and the Palestinian from that land, all as elements, and then becomes and claims sovereignty over it. So I think I'm completely with you, and that's why, for example, wherever there's an Armenian, what you were describing is effectively the way in which you could say, oh, Armenians are in Georgia or in Azerbaijan or in what is now known as Turkey. Therefore, this is historic Armenia, rather than thinking about these are lands that are indigenously Armenian. They are, and they are of that land. When you go to what is now Eastern Turkey, this is, I mean, the scars, the remnants, the signs of Armenian presence still is there. And you recognize that this is Armenian land, but it's only through a nationalist paradigm where you can only see that as only Armenian land. And one that doesn't ever change, obviously, for example, with whether it's Kurds coming in or Syrians or whatever, so I want to also just kind of like parse out a very important critique of sovereignty and nationalism, but also understand that it doesn't always work in the same ways, not to excuse Armenian nationalism or Palestinian nationalism
or
Lebanese nationalism over one, but we can see then how Zionism is a particular form of settler colonialism and settler colonial nationalism that doesn't come from a place. The place that it comes from is someplace else, and then is grafted onto the territory.
Well, it's a constructed place,
Right.
and now we're back to reality bending.
And the only reason why I want to make that clear is also because it brings us back to something very important, especially within the Palestinian context right now, is the question of national struggle. Right? Because as an anarchist, you always hear like, oh, nationalism is the bastion of cowards or some ridiculous thing like that. So it's like, you're a dumbass because you don't know what it is to have lived under colonialism that creates national identities and becomes the only formation through which you can organize to overthrow your colonizer. So for example, I'm not as much of a critic of Armenian nationalism when it's fighting against, the Republic, the Republic of the Kemalists, right? The Republic of Turkey, or when you have, your Armenian heroes assassinating, the perpetrators of the genocide. That's when I'm less like,
and getting amnesty for it.
Getting amnesty, exactly. So I just want to kind of like, I don't know if that's sort of convoluted, but it's like we have a very important critique of nationalism and sovereignty and understand how it works, but also in doing so, we don't want to discredit national liberation struggles, right?
I know that we have very little time left, and this has been such a wonderful discussion, and I want us to kind of I've said this to you before, but one of the things that both Milena and I noticed, and it kind of just like jumped out of your book to us as we were reading independently, was the way in which you enfold Armenians into Palestinian society, which of course goes against any sovereign nationalist kind of rigid understanding of nation. And so if you could each, and I know that you've said a little bit here and there in this conversation already, but if you could just talk about your connections to Armenia and Armenianness, and especially how you see Armenians as part of, and of course they have been a part of Palestinian society.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't nerdy, and it's where I'm like,
get nerdy.
I mean, it's funny.
You love nerds.
We're all nerds. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, the issue, it's funny because I think some people don't necessarily always put forward the argument about like why do Armenians end up in the Arab world after the genocide? It's because they were already there, right? Because there were communities, Armenian communities, who had existed there for hundreds of years, uh, in Cairo, in Alexandria, in Beirut, and of course, and in Halab, in Syria, of course, throughout Iran, and especially Palestine. There is the Armenian quarter. I mean, there is a large part of
which is under attack.
which is under attack, a large part of Jerusalem, which is Armenian, and um, so for us, I think to think about including or not Armenians, it seems quite natural. The Armenians are of that place as well. I mean, I think, um, and then of course you talk about the genocide, you talk about the influx of displaced Armenians, and then the ways in which Armenians, in many ways, despite the discrimination against them, and there has been and there is, and there's also the ways in which Armenians might also hesitate to, in order to maintain their identity, also, have their enclaves, ethnic enclaves, which is completely cool. Um, it's Armenians have always been integrated into these countries. I mean, Armenians are part of Lebanese society, for example, and they're part of Palestinian society. And I mean the tiles on the Dome of the Rock, the mosque, are Armenian. The Belian, those beautiful tiles are made by Armenian artisans, right? So it's not even like a Christian thing. Like, of course, Armenians going to hang out with like Arab Christians. No, it's like these Armenian. Like when you look at what is now Palestinian tiles, those tiles, the typical Palestinian tiles, are basically Syrian and Armenian. And that's because of Syrian and Armenian, because they're from largely the same place, and they were kicked. They both genocided, right? Ashuriyin and Syrian, all the immigrants into historic Palestine. So how can we not? How can we write a history of anything or talk about anything without having Armenians in this narrative, which they're thoroughly integrated into?
Yeah, I agree completely, and it's an interesting thing to have folks register this, and we've had folks be like, this is the first time that I read something that is included, and not in like a and just a passing mention, which means a lot to us personally. And I think I want to sort of name this and go back to where we started about reality bending. Like, these are political interventions about always refusing disavowals around material reality, and how that becomes part of an academic project. I mean, I think a lot of people ask us, like, how do you write a book that's sort of politically honest? And it's sort of like, well, this is, how do you not, number one, but also it is a practice. It is a practice to say we refuse to disavow histories. And this is what saturates our life as Arabs. And this is, I think, a piece to say too, is part of the reason when we say we are Arabs, that is a political intervention also that I think needs to be said more clearly. It also means to trouble what the category of Arab means. And I think this is part of how we see Armenia and Armenians as part of that, is that like the category of Arab, much like you were saying before about like national history, it can mean something very exclusive and can include xenophobia in it. And this is as somebody, as Lebanese Arabs, particularly talking about the history of our Armenian siblings being in Lebanon for generations, to still somehow, even in practice or in psychic mind, think of it as separate from, right? This sort of idea of when we claim Arabness, to say that Arabness, like your podcast is saying, there's an expansiveness to that can contest the hegemonic, potentially race, potentially xenophobic idea of what that means, that excludes, rather than sort of says there is a rich history here that didn't start yesterday, that didn't start with the genocide, that certainly has an inflection point around these things that we honor and have to understand, that there's a reason. This goes back to the condition that people are in diaspora for a reason, right? And that reason is genocidal, just like we can say around Palestine and the Nakba and all these sorts of things. That there is an important political relational practice around that. And so there's an ease with which, yes, this makes complete sense to us, and it isn't. We didn't have to think twice about it. And also, perhaps we need to be more specific about that is what it means to have a political commitment, and that hopefully our political commitments can become so easy, quote unquote, that we're not thinking about, we're not having to market it because that's the orientation to the world and to a contestation and a troubling of these categories that come to be, understood as the norm. And it's just like, that's not what we're about.
Also, I just want to note, you know, Armenians are, one of the few people in modern history who have suffered from genocide. And now the bond between
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have another episode of this podcast from earlier that's on Palestine, Armenia, and we talk there about various with our colleague Nelly Sarkisian. And one of the things, that I didn't say there that had been part of our conversations leading up to recording was that it is this genocide, the one going on right now in Palestine, that kind of that in some strange way that I can't quite I can't quite understand exactly yet, maybe, that made me realize that genocide and um, the that genocide images of it and understandings of myself as a kind of survivor of it in the long historical trajectory were actually a part of me for a long time, that in some ways, and because genocide has been so kind of hammered into us as Armenian subjects over the last century. And as a feminist, as a queer person in Armenia, both within the diaspora and in the Republic where I've spent time, it's almost as if like I am a violation to Armenianness. Because of genocide. And so genocide has always been that thing. So I've always, in some ways, kind of rejected that as a meaningful history, as a history that in some ways produces me as a subject. And it is actually images of the genocide on Palestinians today that I came to the recognition of the fact that those images touch me in a way that I think they should touch every fucking human being on the planet. But they touch me in a way that I think goes beyond me as a human being. I think they get at something that has been instilled in me historically and subjectively for a long time. And that I think was really it was a really troubling kind of realization for me to come to grips with. And quite painful, but it's yeah, but I don't think that it's unique to Armenians, Palestinians, and even Jews historically, and others who have also been the subject and object of genocide.
right. And I to move from the affective to the nerdy, but but there is something to be said about that, right? There is something
Yeah.
to be said about what the histories of genocide give us and how they bond people, which is of course the tragedy of where Israel is built on a genocide, and it's a state now, it's a genocidal state. But also, I just want to kind of recall thinking about that triumvirate. It's actually many Black, Indigenous, and Armenian scholars in the 1990s that actually wrenched the word genocide from exclusively being associated with the Holocaust.
Mhm.
Before the 1990s, when you said genocide, it was pretty much the Holocaust, right? And there are a number of wonderful, Jewish scholars who study genocide who would say, yeah, genocide happened, but the Holocaust would always be sort of like the archetype, and everything else could fall from that. But I think it's just really important for us to remember the work that was done by mostly Black American and Indigenous American scholars, as well as Armenians in the 90s and early 2000s, to really think about, to really allow us to understand what genocide looks like and what genocide feels like. And that also has to do with, as you're saying, the way genocide is sort of passed down
Mhm.
through generations, and becomes wired into one's identity.
I think we have to let you go now, even though we want to keep you forever.
Maybe we will have the honor of having you join us again sometime in the future. But thank you so much for joining us in this very enriching conversation. We are so glad for it.
Thank
Thank
you
you
to
both.
both for the
I
work that
just want to say I feel so humbled to know you, get to know you even more in this episode. I almost feel like I'm like here, I'm like saying goodbye to guests who just came over to my house. So usually it would take a long time by the door, you know.
Yes.
But I just yeah, like, and just in that sense, then you're always welcome as guests in
Thank
my
you.
house, any house that would be, whether it's this podcast, whether it's my house in Yerevan, or anywhere that I would be.
Thank you.
Thank
It feels like that. Yeah, I want the prolonged goodbye. These podcasts don't make that possible, but we're certainly holding it close. And it's very special to us. It's very moving, and your labor is awesome.
Right.
Everybody follow and like and do all the things that make podcasts survive.
Yes, please like, subscribe, follow, comment,
All
share,
the things.
all of the things. And our next episode will be up on June 13th. So please do look out for that. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.